My brother didn't just steal my husband's life insurance money. He stole 4 years of my life. And the worst part is that he stood in that courtroom, watching them lead me away, without making a single sound. I remember the exact moment the judge read the verdict, guilty. I turned to look at my brother sitting in the gallery. He didn't cry. He didn't look away. He just gave me this small, almost imperceptible nod, like he was confirming something to himself. And then he turned and whispered something to his wife beside him. That nod stayed with me every single night in prison. It was the most honest thing he'd done in years. My name is Fern Calloway, and until I was 31 years old, I believed that grief was the hardest thing a person could survive. I was wrong. What came after grief was harder. If stories like this one stay with you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Leave a comment below, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. My husband died on a Tuesday in November, on Highway 400 just north of Barrie. Black ice. The paramedic said he didn't suffer. I've held on to that sentence like it was something solid, something I could carry with me. He was 42 years old, a landscape architect who spent his weekends drawing plans for a backyard renovation we kept meaning to start. We'd been married 7 years. We didn't have children yet. We were still figuring out the timing. My husband had a life insurance policy through Sun Life, $1.4 million, which sounds like an enormous amount of money until you're sitting in a grief counselor's office in Barrie, Ontario, trying to remember how to breathe. We also owned a house together in a subdivision just outside of town, a sensible semi-detached with a cold garage and a backyard that never did get renovated. My older brother had never been particularly close with my husband. They were polite at Christmas dinners, distant in the way that some men are when they don't have anything obvious in common. My brother worked in commercial real estate in Mississauga. He knew the value of property and insurance policies before he ever knew the value of a person. 3 months after my husband's funeral, a detective from the Ontario Provincial Police knocked on my door. I thought it was a mistake. I genuinely stood there in my doorway holding a mug of tea, still in grief, still barely sleeping, and I assumed they had the wrong address. They didn't. My brother had filed a formal complaint, alleging that I had manipulated my husband during the final months of his life, that I had exploited a period of cognitive decline to forge his signature on updated beneficiary documents, redirect money from our joint accounts, and change the terms of his estate plan to exclude my husband's family entirely. My brother claimed my husband had confided in him, that he felt pressured by me. He claimed to have documentation. The documentation, it turned out, consisted of printed email transcripts that looked like they'd come from my account, a second cell phone found in our storage locker that investigators said contained financial records, and a signed statement from one of my brother's longtime friends, who claimed to have overheard a conversation at our home, in which I pressured my husband to transfer funds without telling anyone. I didn't own a second phone. I had never seen those email transcripts, and I had never met my brother's friend more than twice at family barbecues. None of that mattered as much as it should have. The thing about being accused of financially exploiting someone who can no longer speak for themselves is that the person you most need to defend you is already gone. My husband couldn't take the stand. He couldn't explain his own intentions. Everything that I knew about our marriage, the conversations, the plans we had made together, the complete ordinariness of our financial life, lived entirely inside my memory, and memory is not evidence. My brother, on the other hand, was available, articulate, and visibly grieving. He wore the same navy suit to every court appearance. He always looked slightly tired, the way people look when they've been doing the hard work of telling the truth. The trial lasted 11 days. I watched my brother take the stand and describe, in careful, measured language, how he had grown concerned about my husband's mental state in the year before his death. He referenced a visit where my husband had seemed confused. He said my husband had called him 3 times in the final month, worried about where the money was going. He said he tried to raise his concerns with me directly, but that I had become defensive and hostile. And this is the question I kept asking myself in those 11 days. Why would a man fabricate all of that about his own sister? What kind of person looks a jury in the eye and destroys someone they grew up with? The answer, I would eventually learn, was a man who had already decided what that person was worth to him compared to $1.4 million. My brother's friend corroborated the story, sat 2 feet from the jury and described, in specific detail, a scene that never happened. My lawyer, A duty counsel who was doing her genuine best with what she had, argued the evidence was circumstantial. She questioned the chain of custody on the phone. She pointed out that the email timestamps didn't align with my cell tower data from those evenings. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. Guilty, 4 years, federal institution. As the officers led me out, I looked at my brother one last time. His wife had her head on his shoulder. He had his arm around her. He looked like a man who had just endured something terrible and survived it. He looked like the victim. I thought about that image for 4 years. The first months inside were the kind of disorienting that doesn't have a proper word for it. I had spent my adult life working as an occupational therapist at a hospital in Barrie. I was used to routines that revolved around other people's needs. Prison had routines too, but they belonged to no one. They were just the shape of the days, imposed from outside, with no logic you could hold on to. I wrote letters to everyone I knew. Most of them wrote back at first, then fewer did, then almost none. A colleague I'd worked alongside for 6 years sent me a card in January of my first year. She wrote that she believed in me, and that she'd be thinking of me. I never heard from her again. I understood. Believing in someone costs something when the verdict has already been read aloud in public. It's easier to hold that belief quietly and then let it go. My closest friend stopped returning calls after 8 months. She left a message through the prison's phone system, explaining that it was too hard for her to maintain the connection while raising 2 children and managing her own life. She said she hoped I would understand. I did understand. I also sat on the edge of my cot and cried in a way I hadn't since the night my husband died, because understanding something and being at peace with it are 2 completely different things. The worst part was not the loss of freedom. It was the slow, grinding erosion of certainty. When enough people treat you as guilty, when the evidence has been laid out in a courtroom and a jury has spoken, there are nights when you lie awake and wonder whether the story you remember is the true one. I knew it was. I never stopped knowing it was. But knowing something and feeling certain about it are not always the same thing at 3 in the morning. What kept me going, if I am honest, was one specific memory. The last evening my husband and I spent together before his accident. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. He was reviewing revised drawings for a client project, and I was marking patient notes. It was completely unremarkable, the kind of evening that comprises most of a marriage. At some point he looked up and said, without much context, that he'd updated the folder on his laptop with the most recent insurance documents because he'd had a meeting with the notary that week. He said it the way you'd say anything domestic and administrative, just so you know. I thought about that sentence constantly in prison. There was a folder on his laptop. My husband's laptop had been logged as part of the estate proceeding, and then released once the trial concluded. It was sitting, as far as I knew, with the estate notary, a man named Conrad Holt who had handled my husband's file and who had been quietly troubled from the very beginning by certain aspects of the case. Conrad was not a dramatic man. He was the kind of person who took thorough notes and sent follow-up emails and believed, in a methodical way, that administrative records told the truth about things even when people didn't. During the trial, he had submitted a statement noting that the timeline on certain estate documents didn't align with his own appointment records. The judge had acknowledged it and moved on. Conrad didn't move on. For 2 years after my conviction, on his own time, he continued to review the materials connected to my husband's estate. He told me later that something about the email evidence had never settled right with him. He knew the tone of my husband's communication. They had worked together on the estate plan for 18 months, and the printed transcripts didn't read like the man he had known. Then, in the 3rd year of my sentence, Conrad was preparing to archive the estate files before permanent closure. That process required a final review of all physical materials in his office, including a storage box kept from the original estate proceeding. Inside that box, still in the original padded sleeve, was my husband's laptop. He almost didn't open it. He told me he nearly handed it directly to the archiving service without a second thought. But something, he described it as a habit of thoroughness, nothing dramatic, made him power it on first. The battery was dead, so he plugged it in and waited. When the screen came up, most of the files were exactly what he expected. Project folders, client drawings, tax documents organized by year, and then, in a folder simply titled Important, he found something that changed everything. There were 11 video files. Each one was a recording my husband had made on his laptop camera, dated across a 6-week period in the autumn before his accident. They were short, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, the longest was 12. In each one, my husband sat at the same kitchen table I remembered, speaking directly into the camera, in that quiet, deliberate way he had when he was thinking something through carefully. The earliest recordings were about the estate plan, why he had made the decisions he had, what he wanted to make clear about his intentions. He spoke about me with the kind of matter-of-fact affection that was entirely him. He wasn't a sentimental person. He didn't use a lot of adjectives. He just said what was true. But in the fourth recording, his tone shifted slightly. He said that my brother had called him 3 times in 2 weeks, asking questions about the estate, about how much the insurance policy was worth, about whether the beneficiary designations could still be changed. He said he had found the calls uncomfortable. He said he had not mentioned it to me because he didn't want to create conflict in the family. He said he had raised his concerns with Conrad at their most recent meeting, and had asked Conrad to note that he was making all estate decisions of his own free will, and without any outside pressure. Conrad checked his own appointment records. The note was there, he had written it himself. He had somehow not connected it to my trial. In the 7th recording, my husband said something that made Conrad call a colleague immediately after watching it. He said, "If anything happens to me, and if there is ever any question about my estate, I want it known that my decisions were my own. I want it known that my wife never pressured me about anything financial. And I want it known that I am concerned about my brother-in-law's interest in this estate, because it does not feel like family concern. It feels like something else." He used my brother's full name. He said it directly into the camera, looking straight ahead, the way he always looked when he had decided something. Conrad spent the next 3 weeks documenting everything before he brought it to anyone. He engaged a digital forensics firm to authenticate the files. The metadata confirmed the recordings were made on the dates shown and had never been altered. He cross-referenced the timestamps with his own appointment records, with my husband's phone records, with cell tower data from the evenings in question. Then he contacted Innocence Canada. I didn't find out any of this until Conrad requested an urgent meeting with a duty lawyer at my institution, and I was brought into a small interview room one Thursday afternoon, still wearing the standard issue clothing I'd been in for 3.5 years. Conrad sat across from me and folded his hands on the table, and told me about the folder titled Important, and the 11 video files, and what my husband had said in the 7th one. I didn't speak for a long time after he finished. I had spent 3.5 years being angry in the controlled, careful way you have to be angry when you're incarcerated, keeping it interior, not letting it show, because showing it costs you things you need. Sitting in that room, I didn't feel anger. I felt something much quieter than anger. I felt the precise sensation of being exactly right about something for the first time in years, and having the world finally agree. The legal process that followed was not fast. It is never fast, but it was thorough. Forensic examiners were brought in to re-examine the email evidence that had been used against me. With the authentication of my husband's recordings as a baseline, investigators were able to take a second look at the metadata on those printed transcripts. The inconsistencies Conrad had flagged years earlier now had a different context. The emails had been generated from an account that used my login credentials, but was accessed through a device that was never registered to me. A device whose IP address, traced through the service provider, resolved to a location in Mississauga. The second phone from our storage locker was re-examined. The locker had been accessed 8 months before my husband's death. The access log from the storage facility showed my keycard had been used, but the timestamp was during working hours, when I was on a 12-hour shift at the hospital. My time card records were still archived. While the appeal application was moving through the courts, federal investigators opened a separate financial fraud inquiry. What they found was that my brother had, within 6 weeks of my conviction, applied to become the administrator of my husband's estate by filing a legal challenge, claiming the original estate plan was invalid on the grounds that it had been influenced by financial manipulation. The same manipulation he had accused me of. The application had stalled in probate court, but it existed. He had also, investigators discovered, made 3 appointments with a real estate agent in Barrie to assess the market value of our house. He had never disclosed this to the court. He had never mentioned it to anyone. By the time investigators arrived at his home in Mississauga with a warrant, my brother had already started packing. Not for a vacation. The bags were large. The travel bookings were international. His wife said she didn't know anything about any of it. Whether or not that was true, I have never been able to decide. Federal agents arrested him at Pearson Airport, Terminal 1. He was boarding a flight to Lisbon. I saw the footage later, security camera video that made the evening news. He was wearing a jacket I recognized from Christmas dinners. He had a carry-on bag and a boarding pass in his hand. He looked for a moment like any other traveler. Then the officers approached him and his face changed. He stopped being the composed man in the navy suit. He became something smaller. I was not there to see it in person. I was still inside. But someone saved the clip and I watched it the following week alone on a small screen in the institution's common room. I sat very still for a long time after it ended. The Ontario Court of Appeal reviewed the full body of new evidence, the video recordings, the digital forensics, the storage facility logs, the financial documents, and the testimony that Conrad provided about his appointment records and the note he'd written at my husband's request. They also reviewed the conduct of my original trial, where it emerged that investigators had received the storage locker access data early in the proceedings, but had not cross-referenced it against my employment records. Whether that was negligence or something more deliberate, the court did not formally determine. Either way, the result was the same. I had been convicted without the jury ever being given the full picture. 6 months after Conrad found that laptop, I walked out of the Federal Correctional Facility in Northern Ontario on a Tuesday morning in March. There was still snow on the ground. The air smelled like cold and pine, and something underneath that I couldn't name. Something I had been missing for 4 years without realizing it was the specific smell of outside. Conrad was waiting in the car park. He handed me a coffee from Tim Hortons. Large, 2 sugars, which was how he'd learned I took it from a detail buried in the legal documents. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at that, so I just held the cup with both hands and stood there for a moment, in the cold, not moving, not needing to. The civil process that followed my exoneration resulted in a financial compensation order, for the wrongful conviction, for the estate assets my brother had attempted to access, for legal costs and loss of income across 4 years. No amount of money was going to give me back my 30s, or the career I'd built, or the particular Tuesday in November that had started all of this. But the order acknowledged what had been taken, and that acknowledgement mattered in a way I hadn't expected it to. I went back to Barrie. I stayed in a short-term rental for the first few months while the house situation was resolved. My husband's estate was finally settled in accordance with his actual wishes, as documented in his video recordings which the court formally accepted into the estate record. The house was mine. I stood in the cold garage for a long time the first evening I walked back through the door. Old acquaintances reached out when the story became public. Some of them were genuine. Some were the specific kind of person who wants proximity to a story they watched unfold from a distance. I listened to everyone and kept only the ones who had something honest to say. My closest friend, the one who had stopped returning calls, sent a letter. It was long and careful, and I could tell she had rewritten it more than once. She said she was sorry. She said she had convinced herself that staying neutral was a form of kindness, when it was really just a form of comfort. I read the letter twice and then put it away. I didn't know yet whether I would respond. Forgiveness, I had learned, is not the same as trust. It is something you do in your own chest, in the private quiet of your own reckoning, not for the other person but for yourself. Carrying 4 years of rage into the rest of my life would only give my brother another 4 years of my time, and he had already taken more than enough. My brother pleaded not guilty at his first court appearance. The evidence was not cooperative with that position. He eventually changed his plea partway through the proceedings and was convicted on charges of fraud, obstruction of justice, and identity-related offenses under the criminal code. His sentencing was substantial. His wife filed for divorce before the trial concluded. I did not attend his sentencing. I had a different place to be that day. I drove out to the cemetery where my husband was buried on a Thursday afternoon, a week after my brother's sentence was handed down. I'd been avoiding it since my release. Every time I considered going, I found reasons to delay. But you have to go, eventually. You can only carry a thing by yourself for so long before you need to set it down somewhere real. I brought him a small bunch of birch branches with the leaves still on, because he'd always liked birch trees, and I didn't want to bring something that looked like a formal occasion. I stood there for a long time without speaking. A car passed on the road beyond the fence. The afternoon was flat and gray and very still. I told him what had happened. All of it, The way you tell things to someone who already knows but deserves to hear it said out loud. I told him Conrad had found the laptop. I told him the recordings had survived 4 years in a storage sleeve in a law office, and had still been exactly what they needed to be. I told him that the 7th video, the one where he looked directly into the camera and said my name and told the truth, had done more for me than anything I had managed to do for myself. I stayed until the cold became something I couldn't ignore, and then I said what I had come to say. I told him, I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry that what they did to your memory was part of what they did to me. But the record you left survived, and so did I. I am still working out what comes next. I have begun the process of reinstating my occupational therapy registration with the Regulatory College in Ontario. There is a process for wrongful conviction cases, and Conrad has been helping me navigate it with the same methodical care he brings to everything. I am in a city I know, in a house I understand, in a life that was interrupted and is now slowly resuming its shape. Some evenings I sit at the kitchen table where my husband used to work on his drawings, and I think about how much of what happened came down to one decision he made alone, quietly, without telling me. He turned on his laptop camera and talked into it because he wanted a record. He did it because he was careful and precise, and because he had noticed something that made him uneasy. And he didn't know what to do with the feeling, except to document it honestly. He saved my life from inside a folder he titled Important. For a long time, I believed the hardest part of what I survived was the prison sentence, or the trial, or the moment the verdict was read out loud in a room full of people who believed my brother over me. But I think now that the hardest part was the years before Conrad opened that laptop, when I had to hold on to the truth of my own life without anyone else in the world holding it with me. That part is over. My brother stole 4 years from me. He tried to take everything my husband had left behind and everything I had built for the years ahead. What he couldn't steal was the fact that my husband had seen him coming and that my husband had left a record. And in the end, that record was enough. I don't spend much time wondering what my brother thinks about now, sitting where he's sitting. I have a house with a backyard that never got renovated, and this spring I finally hired someone to come and draw up a proper plan for it. The landscaper I found works out of a small firm in Barrie. When I met with him, I told him what the space had been waiting for. He listened carefully and didn't ask too many questions. He sent me a draft within the week. I keep it pinned to the refrigerator. It looks exactly like something my husband would have designed himself.